what does attendance of your trainings look like? Especially if they're trainings that aren't necessarily like job skill training, but more like interpersonal and communication training, like things that, that are indicators of how engaged people are to improve, right, at your company. Those are all, I think, indicators of how engaged employees are.
This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast where we talk to HR innovators about all things people leadership. If you're looking for places to find about new ways to think about the world of work, this is the podcast for you. Please subscribe from your favorite podcast listening platform today and leave us a review. Rebel on, HR Rebels. All right, Rebel HR listeners, really excited for the conversation this week. Thank you for joining us. I'm here with Molly Burdess, our intrepid co-host, and today we are talking with Cynthia Owyoung. She is Robinhood's Vice President of Inclusion, Equity, and Belonging, partnering with business leaders, employee resource groups, and the People Experience team to support Robinhood's mission to democratize finance for all. She is also the founder of Breaking Glass Forums, developing strategies to accelerate diverse leadership and inclusive organizations. She's led multiple initiatives for diversity, equity, and inclusion over 15 years as an executive in multiple organizations. And she is the author of the book, All Are Welcome, How to Build a Real Workplace Culture of Inclusion That Delivers Results, out at bookstores everywhere. Welcome to the show, Cynthia.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Kyle and Molly. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we are extremely excited to have you here. I'll be honest, as I was prepping for this interview, I just got more and more excited to meet you and to learn. The book is wonderful, and I think there's just so much that our listeners can take away from this as we try to change the face of human resources and the organizations that we support. So I want to start off by understanding what got you interested in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Great question, Kyle. So to talk about my why, I have to share my personal story in this space, right? Because most people who go into DEI work, it tends to come from a very personal place, and I'm no exception. So my parents are immigrants. I am a first generation born here in America. I am Asian by background. I'm also a woman, obviously, for those of you who might be listening. And I have a brother who is developmentally disabled and another brother who is gay. And we grew up in a primarily African-American neighborhood. And my parents were kind of like lower middle class over time, although when they came here really with nothing. So, I've got all of these different dimensions of diversity that they've just been part of my life, right, since the beginning. And that have given me this very sharpened empathy for different lived experiences and a desire to always correct for social injustice wherever I see it. Now, I didn't actually do that in my initial career. I went into marketing first because I've always been curious about what motivates people. And I thought, that's a great way to apply that in a way that's going to be sort of sustainable for me. But then I realized after about 10 years of that I wasn't super personally fulfilled by that work, right? I mean, I was just selling, widgets to people who maybe didn't necessarily need it. And I thought, well, there's got to be something more to work, and my purpose, right, in life. And so I went back to school thinking I was going to start a nonprofit, and instead came across a diversity management class. And that's when the first light bulb went off that I could meld sort of my personal background with an actual career, right? And so, I remember this external speaker who was doing diversity management at Toyota came in to talk about the work that she did. And I was like, oh my gosh, how do I do that? You help people create access to opportunities and helping them thrive and grow no matter what their backgrounds are. I've been in the middle of looking for a job for my disabled brother for 3 years and not having very much luck in it. I want to make that easier for people, right? I want to be the one that opens the doors as opposed to, the other side of it where I'm knocking on them. So that's what started me down the path and why I do the work now 20 years later still.
That's amazing. And thank you so much for sharing that story and kind of, being vulnerable in that space. I think, really powerful to hear, the context that you come from and that you look at this work in. So as you think about, DEI, I think it's one of those things that, there's been a lot of focus on it over the last few years, of course, right? And for for good reason with some of the things that are happening in our society. But you've obviously been doing this work a lot longer than that. And so as you approach the role that you play as a senior executive who is overseeing the DEI journey of an organization, how do you make sure that this is more than a passing focus? And how do you truly ensure that this gets interwoven into kind of the fabric of an organization's culture?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. I think, we're all in this space of DEI really trying to figure that out even now, in different ways than when I started, right, 20 years ago. But still, I think, the answer isn't as easy as just like, what you hear some people say out there, just hire more people from diverse backgrounds, right? If it were that easy, we would all be doing it and we wouldn't have this as a field. And so, I think that really integrating the work into business process and purpose and strategies of an organization are really integral to being able to drive more incremental progress in this space. And what I mean by that is like, when I started, it used to be very much a compliance function, right? It used to be like affirmative action was how we treated diversity and inclusion, because the government required us to do something in terms of making some effort towards driving equity and diversity inside our organizations. And then it necessarily evolved from that to, diversity, equity, inclusion being more of like a reason for creativity and innovation, right? Because you saw all these great research studies that talked about how more diverse teams are more creative and innovative. Before I think it evolved from there into much more sort of transparency and accountability. Like you think back to 2014 when Google first released their demographic numbers, and that caused like this huge ripple effect across the industry, not just in tech, but across many other industries, to start releasing their numbers and being transparent and accountable to the public and employees and customers and shareholders, right? About their efforts and what they were doing and if they were even making a dent in their numbers moving forward. So that, I think now it's much more about, even though we've had that level of transparency, we haven't seen many of those numbers shift significantly, right? And so now, like, I think the focus is really much more around business strategy and performance and how, we can redefine organizations and success and effectiveness of those organizations as being directly tied to their ability to attract, retain, develop more diversity, better serve diverse customers, like better drive innovation and financial performance. All of those things are tied to DEI work. And I think there's now more of an acknowledgement of that in the space and why this needs to be really integrated into all aspects of what businesses do.
100%. And not to give anything away, but in the book, there are a lot of really actionable strategies and thought-provoking topics to start to uncover those questions. So I'd encourage, if you get a chance, pick up the book. All are welcome. There's just some great content in there for an HR practitioner trying to work through this challenge. One thing I want to talk about that I'm curious to get your perspective on this. So, one of the things I've learned as I've very much a novice and kind of a constant learner in the DEI space is language really matters. The words that you use really matter, and you can't be flippant with how you say things. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about your focus that is broader than DEI. There's a B. It's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So as you label it DEIB, what is your reason why on putting the B in there? What does the belonging mean to you?
Yeah, there's a great analogy around sort of the different definitions of each of those terms, right? That if anyone follows Vernee Myers, who's the VP of Inclusion Strategy at Netflix, she has this brilliant TED Talk out there that talks about how we move towards diversity as opposed to away from it. And in it, she defines diversity and inclusion using sort of a party analogy, right? She uses diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. Now, I like to take that analogy a little bit further and add in that equity is about giving people dance lessons if they need it at that party. And belonging is knowing all the songs, right? And so, you have to think about adding in those two dimensions, and belonging is so important because it's one thing to bring that diversity into your organization. And quite another thing to leverage that diversity to its fullest potential, which is really that inclusion piece of it. But if people aren't feeling like they're in a place that they're connected to the people, your teams, that they can really be their full authentic selves, then that is not going to drive retention, right? Like you have to not just bring diversity into the organization, you have to incentivize it to want to stay, right? And that's where the belonging piece really comes in. Lots of good research out there also shows that belonging is one of those key drivers for engagement at a company and retention as a result. And so there's lots of like good reasons, just concrete reasons around why people need to really create that sense of connection and belonging for employees within their organizations, because it will help your bottom line, frankly. But it also helps people to feel like they have a place in this world, in your company, right, that they want to be in. And I think that's what leads to higher productivity as a result.
Your expansion of that analogy is spot on. Perfect.
Oh, thank you for that, Molly.
It can be stressful to choose the perfect swag to order for your company, especially when trying to find items that people will actually want to keep. That's why I'm thrilled to tell you about swag.com. Swag.com makes picking out corporate gifts simple and fun. Swag.com sent me one of their custom swag boxes, and my favorite new piece of swag is a super cool coffee mug that keeps my coffee warm while I'm getting ready for a busy day of HRing it up. Swag.com makes it their business to offer a wide range of products, so there's something for everyone. They carry premium brands like the North Face, Camelback, Ray-Ban, and more. You can even create custom swag boxes full of great branded items, all with your company's logo or artwork delivered in a unique box designed for your company. And with swag.com, you can easily set up a corporate gifting program for your team with no platform fees. Their team of expert curators are standing by to help you design the perfect gifts for your team. Go to swag.com today for the perfect swag and custom gifts for your company. Right now, I have a special offer for our Rebel HR listeners to help get you started. 10% off your order, but only when you go to swag.com/rebel and enter promo code REBEL10. Remember, for 10% off, go to swag.com/rebel and use promo code REBEL10. Thanks. Rebel on.
So one thing, engagement is a big word that we talk a lot about. And of course, everyone does engagement surveys. But what other ways can we evaluate engagement within our organization, specifically with DE&I?
So beyond surveys, right? I think that, there's nothing better than actually getting out there and talking to your employees, right? To understand what their experiences are truly within the organization, because numbers will give you sort of like one view into that. But I think if you aren't getting like the stories that live underneath that, then you're missing some of those intangible qualities that may need to be addressed, right? So I think it's important to either talk to your, you can do things like inclusion roundtables as an example, right? Like within your organization where you talk to people just about what is their experience around diversity and inclusion? How do they perceive it at the organization? That will tell you a lot about what, your strengths are, like things that you want to maintain, but also where you might have opportunities to improve. Right. And I think, if you have employee resource groups, right, those employee driven communities that are gathered around a certain characteristic, right? So very often companies will have these ERGs built around whether you are a woman, or if you are Black or Latino, or LGBTQ as an example, right? Like getting out and talking to the people who are in those communities, part of those ERGs, can also give you a really rich source of feedback around the experiences that they're having and whether they're like truly engaged or not, right? So, I think it's important to do the quantitative, right? Like do the surveys and do all the great analysis around that, but to also supplement that with your qualitative information. And then to look at your other metrics, because those are all indicators of engagement too, right? If you're looking at like your attrition metrics, that's a really good indicator if your people are engaged or not, if you see them leaving. And then what are their exit survey results telling you? Right, in terms of why they left. And again, what are the comments there and how do you get underneath that? And I think that there are other things that you could look at that are a little bit more, I guess, unique to your company. So good example, many companies will have like frequent all hands, right? Lots of tech companies have them weekly. Other companies might have them monthly or quarterly. Like what's attendance at those look like? Right? What does attendance of your trainings look like, right? Especially if they're trainings that aren't necessarily like job skill training, but more like interpersonal and communication training, like or things that, that are indicators of how engaged people are to improve, right, at your company. Like those are all, I think, indicators of how engaged employees are.
Absolutely. And in my experience, I think some of the leaders, a lot of the leaders are afraid to have those conversations. Maybe not afraid isn't the right word, but uncomfortable, specifically like verbiage. Like, okay, how do I approach this? As a white male or white female, like how do I have those conversations? Like, what do I even start with? What do I say? What advice would you have for those leaders that are just like, I want to do this. I know I need to do this, but I don't know how.
Oh, there's like a few key things that you have to do. I think one is just get educated. The more educated we are, the knowledgeable about a subject, the more confident we are in being able to talk about that, right? So, going back to Kyle's earlier comments about inclusive language, I think it's really important for people to just like use this amazing tool called the internet, right? To look at like, okay, what are the different perspectives around different terminologies that are used in this space? Very often we're just afraid to even ask, like, how do you want to be addressed, right? And what's the proper way to refer to this community over that community? I think, lots of times people ask me things like, okay, should I refer to, the Black community as being Black or African-American, right? And what's the difference between the two? And I'm like, hey, and I can share that with you, right? You can also ask like, people who are in the Black ERG, but you can also just look it up. Like there's lots of resources online to be able to find answers to those questions. And granted, some of those answers might be conflicting, right? Because I think about like the disability community and how there's a very vocal segment of that population that wants to be identified as disabled, and there's also an equally vocal segment of that population that doesn't want to be identified. And so you get into this like, paralysis when you're like, okay, well, which one do I use? And the best advice I give people is to ask, like ask when you're engaging with people in that community, to ask them how they want to be referred to and what's the best terminology to use. Because there is no one size fits all. And you have to be mindful that there are lots of different considerations across a lot of these. And yes, we can use sort of the most commonly current terms in this space. But again, it always comes down to the individual and being mindful of their perspective. So that's one thing, right? Just get educated. Two, I think, just like take the initiative to ask. And then three, I think practice, like any new skill set, right? We all are going to be uncomfortable learning something new. Like when we're learning how to walk, we fell on our faces, right? When you're learning how to manage for the first time, you're not going to do everything right. And just accept that there's going to be imperfection and, find a safe space where if you're going to want to broach a difficult subject, that you feel like you can get the feedback you need to really do that well. Don't let the first time that, you're engaging with somebody on the topic of racism and anti-racism, right? Like maybe practice that with somebody who you feel like can give you good feedback on, or is a safe space to ask the really deep questions that you want to have, you want to ask, right? But I think it's imperative to again, get comfortable. And to get comfortable, you have to do the things that underlie that to give you the confidence to be able to speak to something. And that involves education, asking, and practice.
Absolutely. I think it's such great advice. And, from my standpoint as a white man in the Midwest in the United States of America, I'm as ignorant as they come to these things. And when I started in this journey and I was relatively new in the human resources space, it quickly became apparent that I had an obligation to learn these things if I wanted to be a good people leader, because I was dealing with some of these topics in a lot of times in a way that I was trying to mitigate conflict or help somebody who had a concern related to, DEIB. And, if you don't take the time and you aren't honest with yourself about what you don't know, you're really gonna struggle. And, I think I think those are great, great topics. I think the challenge is it's easier to not do that. It's more comfortable to not do that, right? And that's where the risk of inaction comes from. And I want to shift gears, and I want to get your perspective. You've been in this space for over 2 decades, and I do think that we've come a long way as a society, realizing how critical this is to the business, and that this is really a business imperative. But we've seen maybe some hiring initiatives, maybe some initiatives around, unconscious bias training. People change their logos to be rainbow colored during, Pride Week. But I still feel like there's so much progress that can be made. And so for those organizations that are sitting here thinking, okay, we know we need to do better. We know we need to do more. Where would you start? What would your recommendation be for an HR leader who's trying to start to enact some of this more cultural change and just be a catalyst for some of these things happening?
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And this as being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
I think that it all depends on kind of where you're at in your organization, right? And really assessing that. So I always tell people to start first with like a sort of a culture audit, if you will, right? Look at your numbers, look at your data, go out and talk to people that we talked about earlier, right? Really understand kind of how that meshes with your business priorities and where your business is at today. That's really important to kind of figure out, okay, what's the first, like, what's that next step that I have to do that's going to be meaningful in this space, right? Because if you're talking to enough employees, you're going to get their perception of whether or not they think your commitment is real or performative, right? If putting that rainbow flag on your logo is enough or they want more, which generally most people do, right? And understand kind of what they'll see as meaningful, right? So I think that there's places where, as just sort of a high level general example, in the aftermath to George Floyd's murder in 2020, right? That was an event that really galvanized a lot of companies to come out and say, we're really committed to racial equity in the workplace. We're doing all of these things to support it, and we're going to be held accountable to these commitments. And yet some of the things that they did, you would see companies that maybe donated like huge numbers, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to external organizations that are working towards racial equity. And that is great. But then their employees were like, well, what are you doing for us internally? Right? Like, we don't even have like a dedicated DEI professional inside the company. And yet you're going to fund all of these external things, right? So, I think when you need to be able to identify those kinds of disconnects, right? And hopefully, mitigate them before they happen, right? So, looking at some of the best practices, and triangulating that with, sort of your business priorities and that assessment of your data and where you're at today to kind of figure out what is that like best, most meaningful action, right, to take. And they don't have to be big, right? They can just be really small things. Like, I'm a big fan of incremental change, because if you do enough small things, they will add up to a really big thing. Right. And so it could be things as simple as like changing your email signatures to include your pronouns, which can go really far in terms of indicating that you're supportive of the LGBTQ community, and you're not going to make people assume what pronouns you use. Right. Which, by the way, has huge benefits for people who have gender neutral names, as well as, people who maybe aren't from our culture and have names that are just unfamiliar, right, from a genderized perspective. So, lots of benefit there. And it's a really small thing that anybody can do today, right? Versus, I am as an HR professional, I've like looked at all this information, I've put together a strategy. And one of the key priorities for our organization is that we're going to hire like 100 people in the next year. And so I might see that as like a huge opportunity to be able to shift the needle. So I'm going to really focus on how we hire. And I'm going to start with something as simple as a job description. And what are the requirements that we're asking for in our job description? And are they truly reflective of the job that we're asking people to do? Or are they nice to have? Right? And what language am I using in that? And so, I think people can go through this process of understanding like what's going to be meaningful, what's going to be incremental, how does this align to the bigger, broader changes that I'm trying to do to help make this business successful. And I think that's the process people need to go through to be able to take this, like, what is that first next step?
Absolutely. I love that approach. And I think it's first of all, you have to know how you're doing, right? And I love the term you use, kind of a culture audit. And I mean, we're HR people. We love audits, right? I mean, that's just that's how most of us are wired. Not you. No, okay, I love audits. I guess maybe I'm unique. But that I think, especially for somebody who's not, maybe this isn't their full-time job. Maybe they're at a smaller organization where there's not, a DEI professional position available. just doing an audit. And there's some out there. And if anybody would like one, send me an email. I've got a couple that I've used in the past that are wonderful, or pick up the book, and I'm sure you can do a little bit of a self-audit with the book. But then I love what you said next, which was that it needs to mesh with your business priorities. And then you mentioned that kind of incremental piece. And I want to highlight that because I thought that was so powerful. And it was the fact that your logic was, let's find an area of the business that we know is changing, i.e. I need to hire 100 people. And then let's go in here and let's make some incremental improvements in hiring, knowing that kind of that compounding effect, that ripple effect will be very large, as opposed to somebody, sending a bunch of, emails demanding that people change their actions. Right. I just think that's such a smart way to go about it. And I just think very powerful examples. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for pointing that out. And, you're right. Like, I'm a big believer in systemic change, right? And so that comes down to looking at how do your processes work to either include or potentially exclude people, either from the conversation or from, advancing within your company, right? And then you can apply that to so many different places. Because for me, it's about floating all boats, right? And the best way to do that is to look at like, what is the impact of how you do things, right? Across the board, as opposed to just saying, oh, like, we're just going to have like a gender initiative, as an example, which I think sometimes can be very necessary. But if you're only focused on like, oh, like this, like women in leadership advancement program, and you're not focused on sort of the underlying reasons that are driving the need for that program in the first place, then you are missing an opportunity to drive change on a real level, right? And then that's part of the title of the book, right? How do you drive that real workplace culture of inclusion, so that you can get the results that you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, and that's kind of where my head was going. And maybe I've been thinking about this the wrong way, but I look at a lot of organizations' leadership teams, and there is not a lot of diversity on those teams. So it's like, okay, does that have to change before there can be real change made in the organization? Or am I thinking of that wrong and I need to take the incremental bottom-up approach?
Great question, Molly. Excuse me. So I think that it's not wrong, right? I think it's a necessary ingredient. It's just not the only one. And it's also not necessarily the place that you have to start, right? So I think that, yes, we all want to see more diversity in leadership, and we've all seen the stats that say that there isn't enough there. And so we should be working on it and understanding, okay, like, how are we hiring at that level? What are we looking for? What potentially artificial limitations are we putting on ourselves when we look for the right talent at that level, right? And I say potentially artificial because lots of times people will say, oh, well, I need somebody who's got 20 years of experience in my industry in order to do this job, right? When, sometimes actually you don't really need somebody with 20 years experience in that industry, because if you do, then you're, historically, then you're going to hire more of the same, right? And if you truly want diversity, then you're going to have to look at, okay, maybe there's an adjacent industry that works just as well, right? That I can get people with experience in, or maybe I don't need the 20 years of experience, right? Maybe I only need 15 or, a different kind of experience, or it's the skill sets that I need, right? But being able to go through that questioning my own status quo process becomes really important to being able to open up your lens to talent that might not fit this like traditional vision of leadership talent that we think we need at a company. So that's kind of like one thing that has to happen. But I say that it doesn't have to happen first, because you can actually drive a lot of change at the grassroots if you have that as a goal in mind too, right? So good example is companies that have been around for like 100 years or even 50, right? If you look at like your diversity numbers over time, especially from a race and gender standpoint, because that's mostly what people have measured, right, from a long time ago, you can see that, their numbers maybe haven't shifted that much 20 years ago versus now, right? And if that's the case, then I would say that, it's because you haven't invested in that long-term vision to change your leadership bench over time, right? If you are seeing those same numbers, then you're not advancing people from those underrepresented pools, and you're not investing in them, right, to get the development opportunities they need to be able to become your future leaders. So it's really necessary to kind of look at what you are doing for people who are lower level in your organization to develop the skill sets that you need for the future, right? And I think that's where a lot of like that grassroots work can also come in, because ERGs play a huge role in being able to develop people, particularly from underrepresented groups. And if we don't value them and see them in that light, then we're also missing that opportunity.
Absolutely.
Makes a ton of sense.
And I think in your book, you do a nice job in the way you described it. It's weaving the DEIB into your talent pool management methods, right? And actually, like you've said a couple of times, it's about the system, right? It's about, actually building those developmental pipelines in a way that supports these efforts, as opposed to having a token, diverse hire. Because I've made that mistake before, and just hiring diversity doesn't work unless you've got the cultural underpinnings to support that, right? Otherwise, it's just a gesture. It's not really systemic or change worthy. So, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I think we could probably go for another 2 or 3 hours and just completely soak up all the knowledge we can get from you, Cynthia. But I know that you are extremely busy, and I want to be mindful of your time. So we're going to shift gears, and we're going to go into the flash round. So are you ready?
All right. Fun times.
All right, here we go. Question number 1. What is your favorite people book?
Oh, yeah. So, the obvious answer is my book. But I'll also give you a more unconventional one, which is there's a book called Working Out Loud, and I can't remember the author's name, but that was transformational for me in my own personal HR career. When I read that, because I didn't think of myself as being somebody who needed to promote themselves right at work. But what I've learned over time is that, we all need to be marketers of ourselves and our work, right? In order to advance and to drive the change that we want to see, right? So, reading that book really helped me to understand how I could do that better in a way that felt authentic to me. So I recommend it to everyone.
Love that. Working Out Loud. I'm going to check that one out. Question number 2. Who should we be listening to?
I don't know necessarily that I have like a favorite sort of podcast to recommend or something in that space. I do think that the one that I find really fascinating, that gives me a different perspective on things, that is very often missed, is Freakonomics. So the Freakonomics podcast is really cool because if you think about diversity in particular, like it has a diversity of ideas and perspectives and makes you think about problems in a very different way. So I really appreciate that. And I think people always need to expand their apertures. And that's a good way to do that if you listen to that podcast.
I love that. And I've read all those books, and I just reread Freakonomics because I read it 10, 15 years ago. And I'm like, I feel like I forgot a bunch of the great stuff that was in that book, and picked it up, and it was just as good as I remember it. But it's just, it is a systems thinking method. It's and some of the things they talk about are really, really like borderline like offensive and emotional if you take it in the wrong light, but really interesting. Like it's just like statistical analysis. I agree. It's a great way to expand your mindset. All right. Last question here. Hard hitting question. How can our listeners connect with you?
Through all the traditional platforms. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter at Cynthia Owyoung, on Facebook with Breaking Glass Forums, which is my consultancy that I have to support the book. On my website, CynthiaOwyoung.com is another way to get connected to all of those things in one place.
Absolutely. And we will have all that information in the show notes. The book, again, is All Are Welcome: How to Build a Real Workplace Culture of Inclusion That Delivers Results. So, Cynthia, thank you so much for joining us and just for sharing some of the knowledge and for putting in the work to write this book. Just really appreciate you spending some time with us and with our listeners today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I very much appreciate the perspective that you all shared.
Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day. All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.